Okay, great. So we're ready. Once again, welcome. We're so excited for the class. Is the UN good or bad? And where we're going to start is with some of the obvious. Right now, what's going on in the land of Israel, there's a lot of hardships that are going on, a lot of negativity. And that what comes up very often is the whole topic of the United Nations. And I'll start off actually by giving you the answer to the question. Is the UN good or bad? The answer to the question, of course, is both. The UN is good and it's bad. What do I mean? So that's what we're going to discuss today. So I want to start off with actually speaking of some of the bad, because that is some of the things that was in the news recently relating to different decisions that the UN has either made or claimed or brought to other courts of justice and so on and so forth. And there's an interesting pattern that we notice, and that is that if you look at the UN in the past number of years in its history, you'll notice that there's a very clear distinction that Israel receives relative to the rest of the entire world. Now, you may think, well, that makes sense. It's, I don't know, the only place in the world that considers itself a Jewish nation or something else of that style. However, if you look closely to why Israel is unique in its treatment, you may notice that it's not regarding the positivity or the love per se towards the Jewish nation, but on the contrary. And I want to share with you, I'm going to share my screen over here. Should be pretty simple to do. Here we go, share screen. So the institutional bodies within the UN, like the Human Rights Council and the Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, are also biased, spending disproportionate resources and time to attack Israel. The UN issues so many condemnations of Israel that an NGA watchdog that monitors the United Nations issued a list of insane UN decisions that disproportionately target Israel. Now, the reason I wanted to start with this is because we speak of the UN and we're going to be speaking about it today for the next 52 minutes or so. And there are different kind of branches within the UN. And if we kind of distinguish them, it could clear our mind a little bit, because like I started off by saying, well, it's really both. This could help us out because maybe there are parts of it that are completely negative and other parts that are completely positive, or maybe it's a very mixed bag. But these two in particular, and that's why I wanted to start with them, are really areas where the UN can use a little enhancement in their treatment. Because as you'll see over here, the United Nations Human Rights Council, the UNHRC, has a very strong history of obsessive anti-Israel bias at the cost of other far more pressing international human rights concerns. Now, what do we mean by this? So all of us are familiar with different things that are going on in other countries. We didn't only hear of this Israel, we've heard of many other countries. Nonetheless, what do we find? We find that lots of negativity that happens in other countries around the world, if any, barely get condemnations from the UN. So here, for example, as I continue to go through over here, we see, I'm going to pop it up on the screen again, this body that we mentioned, the UNHRC, it was not established so long ago. It only started in 2006. I think everybody on this Zoom was over bar bat mitzvah at that age. If I was, and I assume everybody here was. So in the first year of its existence, in 2006, the UNHRC condemned human rights violation in just one country, Israel. But you know how many times? 8 times. 8 condemnations of Israel in its first year of the council's existence. Now, it almost sounds like this human rights portion of the UN was established to condemn Israel. It opens in 2006. 2006 I think there were some other negative things that may have happened in the world. Nonetheless, only one country was condemned. And like I mentioned, how many times? That's right, 8 times it was condemned. So when you hear that and you hear different things like that, suddenly it can bring a picture and understanding that maybe when people assume that there's an anti-Israel bias in the UN, it's not just out of thin air. So if we continue reading over here, and yet the UNHRC somehow managed to ignore all of the atrocities occurring in some of the other 191 countries in the world. For example, in this year that we're talking about, in 2006, the Indian Army opened fire at peaceful protesters at Kafethar, I don't know how to pronounce that, in Assam, and at least 10 people were killed. Was the violation of human rights of these innocent people murdered by the Indian Army not worthy of condemnation by the UNHRC? Quite amazingly, while the council managed to condemn Israel 8 times that year, did not condemn those who attacked Israel during that same time period. There were terror attacks that happened in Israel in 2006. Nobody that attacked Israel got any sort of condemnation. For example, on April 17, 2006, Palestinian suicide bomber walked into a restaurant in the heart of Tel Aviv and detonated himself, killing 11 people ages 16 to 73 and injuring 70. Why wasn't the Palestinian leadership, which called the attack an act of self-defense, condemned for allowing and encouraging such human rights violations? And it wasn't only in 2006, but this has happened since 2006 on many, many occasions where the UN has single-handedly called out the state of Israel and condemned the state of Israel in ways that it didn't do for anything else. Like we see over here, during its second year of operations, the council condemned Israel 5 more times. That's right. The blatant anti-Israel bias continued. And listen to this. Over the council's first decade, it condemned Israel 62 times, while issuing just 55 condemnations for the rest of the world combined. Now, the reason I'm reading so much over here and just, stating the fact instead of elaborating is because it's mind-boggling. When we see the numbers, a lot of times we hear this idea that the UN is biased against Israel. But when we see the numbers with our own eyes and we compare what actually went on, then suddenly some of maybe what we thought were no, there's no way that's true. We see it so clearly by the facts on the ground. These aren't like everyone could Google this on their own and could see how many times was each country condemned, and you'll see the results, which make no sense because we all know of so many atrocities that are taking place all around the world. So I want to continue here with this. For example, the Council's lack of true concern for human rights violation around the world and its single-minded focus against Israel became most conspicuous in June 2007, when its members voted 46-1 to make Israel's actions a permanent item on the Council's agenda. From that point and onward, every meeting of the UNHRC includes item number 7 on the agenda, Israel and its human rights violations. Let's even pause over here just for a moment. What in the world is going on over here? Every meeting of this Council of the UN, part of the permanent agenda is calling out Israel. And if we continue reading over here, the United States, Australia, and numerous European countries have been critical of the Council for this fixed agenda item, noting that the Council does not scrutinize countries with far worse rights records than Israel. So again, we're seeing also in the condemnations, but also in the general approach to Israel, how negative it is. And it is in other areas too. If we look at certain votes that go on the general human rights floor, not in this council specifically, always the vast majority is so strongly against Israel. And on one hand, you would say it borrows the question of why? Why is it so strong against Israel? But God created the world that we live in a unique way, a way that to see the light sometimes takes a little more effort and a little more work. And negativity, evil, bad, can overpower and overcome. And that's why, of course, it's our jobs, just as human beings, everybody's job, to always try to be focused on seeing what is right and what's wrong. because not always is it the natural way we could see it. I mean, the fact that so many countries, every time, no matter what it is about, if it's against Israel, will just vote for it, that itself shows the idea a little bit. In 2022, General Assembly resolution backing ICJ probe capped year that saw 15 anti-Israel measures compared to 13 against the rest of the world, reinforcing claims of bias. Are we comprehending what's going on over here? Every year, if it wasn't only Israel that was condemned, it was the rest of the world's condemnations didn't come combined to the number of times Israel was condemned. For example, like we said over here, 2022, 15 Israel, and the rest of the world combined 13. Russia was the focus of 6 resolutions. We're talking about 22. This is recently condemning its invasion of Ukraine. North Korea, Afghanistan, I don't know how to pronounce that country, sorry, no offense. Syria, Iran, and the U.S. were hit with one resolution each. Saudi Arabia, China, Lebanon, Turkey, Venezuela, Qatar, which have poor human rights records or were involved in regional conflicts, were not dinged by any resolutions criticizing them. Again, trying to just bring home this point as strongly as possible that it's not like a debate of, is the UN treating Israel fairly? And I got to tell you something. This is related to the news now in general. I have seen quite a few people that have different viewpoints than me. That's the reality in life in general, and about the current conflict, obviously the same. I don't even know if conflict is the right word for it, of what's going on now in Israel. And people that have a different viewpoint than me, I don't take away from the fact that they may think that the media, for example, is very, very biased against their viewpoint, and in this case, in favor of Israel. Having said that, I obviously completely disagree with that. And I think one of the places where Israel has had it very, very hard all along was the area of the PR, was the area of the media and the outlook. And this, what we're bringing out with the UN, is just one place where we see so clearly how Israel is treated. And it's not a theoretical idea, but it's a very specific idea related to directly the UN and Israel. Everybody can look at it with unbiased viewpoints and see how the bias is so strong. So what I tell the people, if I'm speaking to them, is look at it. Just as you see over here, it's black and white. If CNN is sharing a story, then it's perhaps a matter of perspective how people take it. But over here, when it's so clearly that it's a numbers game, we could all take out the computer and see how many times did it happen with Israel, how many times with any other country. Then suddenly we see that things can be perhaps much simpler than we thought originally. So just as it's there by the UN, so to perhaps recognize that the media bias is also a real thing, and it's not just something that somebody that's pro-Israel is just imagining in their head. But that's a little bit of a side note. So is the UN, good or bad? If we pause right here, to me, it looks like if I said it was a little bad, that might be even an understatement. I would say more than just a little bad. However, this is what I want to share, something so vital and so important. I have over here in my hand a book of the Talks of the Rebbe from the year in Hebrew 5752, which corresponds to the year 1992. In the year 1992, almost exactly to the day today, the Rebbe shared a fascinating, powerful talk, and it spoke very directly about the UN. The Rebbe shared that was speaking on Shabbos, on Saturday, and he shared that yesterday, Friday, Erev Shabbos, there was an amazing, amazing event that took place. And the Rebbe's approach is not one of isolation, but one of learning a lesson from anything that we see or hear or that occurs, and especially if it's something so grand that affects the world. What happened on Friday? On Friday, there was a major event that took place between the leaders of two countries. In the Rebbe's language, the Rebbe never said Russia. He always called it Medina Hahi, that means that country. Between that country and America, between Russia and America. That Friday was when there was the huge meeting between America and Russia. Where, as we all know, till 1992, there was a Cold War. There was heavy despise between the two countries. And suddenly, there was a meeting that came out after a lot of work that they were coming to a resolution where they're going to have a sense of peace. Now, this idea, for us that remember the 80s, or for you guys that remember the 80s, was shocking. I mean, I know from the Jewish history perspective that the Jewish people that were there were in terrible conditions. They weren't able to leave if they wanted to, typically. They weren't able to practice Judaism. Typically, a lot of Hasidim were sent to prison. Some of the Rebbes were even put in prison, and it was a torturous situation. Suddenly, this type of, in the early 90s, there's a change of events over here. And suddenly this Cold War between Russia and America is falling to the sides. Now, this happened together with some other countries that were involved in making this happen. And there was other countries also related to this meeting. The idea of the meeting was what? Let's try to nullify war in the world. Let's try to have less fighting in the world. That was the idea of the meeting. Let's try to nullify some of our weapons, and let's have more peace and more unity in the world. And let's work together. Let's try to help civilization. Let's try to help people. Let's try to help make the world a better place. So you had leaders of a few countries, primarily Russia and America, coming together, making this this massive decision together. So when such an event occurs, the Rebbe's approach is what? We have to learn a lesson from this. We can't just, it's not just a random event that occurs, but we must take this and learn a lesson from it. What is the lesson that the Rebbe tells us we can learn from this? So the Rebbe says everything, you have to go back a step, because everything has important lessons that we can apply to our life. And the Rebbe says the lessons over here are even more perhaps prominent because of the relation to not only our life in a specific manner, but, which is not a topic that we're going to talk about this at length, but I've mentioned this in other classes, so I'll just mention it briefly now. We know that the whole world was created for a purpose, and that was that God should have a dwelling place in this world. When is that going to be fulfilled? When we have the coming of Mashiach, the coming of the Messiah. We have been working for thousands of years to make that a reality. But this event that occurred yesterday, perhaps we could connect it with the coming of the Mashiach. And the Rebbe starts off by sharing something which many of us here have heard and are familiar with. But there is a prophecy in Isaiah which speaks so strongly about an amazing idea that is not just an idea that sounds nice, but suddenly we're seeing how this idea is unfolding in front of our eyes. And I'm going to translate the words from the prophet. The Rebbe, of course, says, bringing from the book of Isaiah, one of the prophecies that will happen is they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. No nation will not raise a sword upon another nation, and they will not teach war anymore. Okay, that is a famous prophecy from Isaiah, and the Rebbe is bringing it here to say, wait a second, The prophet says we're going to turn swords, weapons, into plowshares, into things that will help us plant, grow the land, do things of that nature. What announcement was this made? Countries are coming together. We will stop war, turn the sword into what? Plowshares. Instead will help humanity. The Rebbe also mentioned that previously in the week, the president made a announcement related to nuclear, separate from this event that was directly connected with Russia. But anyways, also on the same note, to minimize that and instead help people. So suddenly the Rebbe is taking this prophecy, which was written a few thousand years ago, related to some time of the future, the Messianic era, and saying, look, we're seeing events, and they are so similar to what the prophet is telling us will happen. And the Rebbe continues and adds, this is going to happen through who? Through Mashiach himself. The Messiah is going to make these events happen. Like it says in the beginning of the verses, and I'm continuing to read, and he will judge among the nations and rebuke many nations, referring to the judge being the Mashiach, who will be the master of all the nations and will rebuke them, and he will tell the one by whom an iniquity was found, correct your ways. And due to this, there will not be any more wars between the nations, since he will make peace between them, and they will not need army weapons, and they will transform them into the tools of the ground. For indeed, at the end of days, the temple mountain of Hashem will be magnificently standing, and all the nations will stream to it, and many nations will go, and they will say, let us go and ascend to the mountain of Hashem. And the verses continue, and it's brought on this verse, and the teacher that's mentioned over here, this is Melech HaMashiach, the King Mashiach, and about him it is written, and he will judge, which is how we started off. So the Rebbe is pointing out over here that this prophecy of the future, of there being less wars, more peace, less wars, and instead taking the things that we use to fight, the actual swords or weapons, or perhaps the money that we used to spend on that, and use it instead for ways to make humanity better, starting to happen. And like the verse specifies, this is done through the judge, done through the person. And like the commentaries say, who's the person? That is Melech HaMashiach. That is the person that's going to actually redeem the Jewish people. So let's look at these events, and we can see how these prophecies are beginning to unfold, and they are directly connected to the Messianic era, and even to the person making it happen, the effect that this change is bringing about. So the Rebbe says two main lessons we'll start off with from the events. The first one is the main one that I want to discuss because that is heavily related to our class today. And that is location. Where did this event take place? This event between the countries, between Russia and America, which was a big event, the signing of this new place that we're going to be up to. We're not going to be the same like we were before. Here, right here, I have the picture. I think it's of that signature. Should be able to see it on the screen of the leader of America, the leader of Russia, coming together for this historic moment. Where did it take place? So the Rebbe gives a little backdrop first and says something. You know, you have people that come together. It would make a lot of sense for them to go to the capital of one of the leaders. Maybe if they have meetings multiple times, they'll switch off where it is. But, you know, if they go to Russia, then it could be in Moscow. If they go to America, it could be in Washington. Nonetheless, fascinating enough, it's not there. Rather, this is taking place where? In New York. Okay, that's interesting. What's unique about New York from the Rebbe's perspective first, before we get to where this event took place? Well, New York happens to be the place where we have 770. And the Rebbe, of course, always speaks about his father-in-law, doesn't speak in first person about himself ever. This is the place where his father-in-law settled, where his father-in-law established a house of Torah, And ultimately, this is the place where Torah spreads to the whole world. And as we know today, 30 plus years after 1992, 32 years later, that there is now the outspreading from Brooklyn, from 770 in New York, has spread to every single one of the 50 states now having a Chabad center, to over 100 countries in the world. We mentioned before there's 192 countries. Assuming that number is still the same and there's no more or less countries than that, over half the countries in the world have a Jewish center because of what came out of that synagogue in New York. So New York is a real center for Judaism. And the Rebbe even uses the language, this is the house where the leader of the Jewish people, my father-in-law, is present. And therefore the influence is coming directly out of this house. And that's the city where the meeting took place. Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. Because if you go back just a few years, there was no leader of Jewish people in America. There was no, I mean, for Chabad, of course, but none of, I mean, there was a few people. There was many few people, but there was no center of Judaism. And as we know by the Chabad rabbis, for example, they were in Russia. They were in other countries until they came over here. And if you go back a few hundred years, of course, America had no Judaism at all. And it was all in Europe, and it was all on one part of the world. And suddenly, we're seeing a massive, major change taking place. That's from Judaism being in Europe, Africa, maybe Asia, one part of the world, coming to a new place. And as the Jewish people come there, so too the leader of the Jewish people, the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe moved to America in 1940. And suddenly there is a source of outspread of Judaism from America and from New York in particular. And the Rebbe points out that shows an amazing idea in general, the world's getting refined and prepared in essence for the next stage, the stage of Mashiach. That's what it's about. It's about when the Jewish people are able to not only stay in their one land of Israel, but ultimately have an effect on a large percent of the world. That's when we're ready to really be at the Mashiach time. So by there being such a strong Jewish presence, and not only a presence, but a source of inspiration and a source of outreach and a source of teaching coming from America, that shows that the world is at a new stage of readiness for Mashiach. Not only certain parts of the universe, but many more parts now as well. And as the Rebbe explains, that kind of like a culmination of this has been since 1940 that the previous Rebbe came. And then 1950 passed away, and we have been continuing his work. The Rebbe says, doesn't use the word we, but his work has been continued from 1950, now we're 1992, 42 years later. That's a lot of work in preparing this part of the world as well for what? For the coming of Mashiach. And the Rebbe says, this meeting that happened yesterday, you think it was perhaps by chance? This was the culmination of all of the work. And it was an outcome of this work that this happened. Now we're going to think, what is the Rebbe saying over here? Some Russia, America, this sounds like politics. It sounds like world leaders. It doesn't sound like anything connected to Jewish people or Judaism. Maybe we have a connection because a lot of Jews in Russia that were helped by this. But it sounds very, very distant. But the Rebbe says in this talk some amazing things. Now I just want to take a moment to explain to everybody the idea of the Rebbe sharing this in the talk. So some of the things that are said in this talk, again, 32 years ago, this is very interesting because the Rebbe's talks came out and were publicized in two manners. I'll call it the edited and the unedited version. The unedited version was the raw talk. The edited version are the talks that have like the holy seal of approval from the Rebbe, which means anything that's said here, the Rebbe not only said it, maybe even said on Shabbos when, there's no broadcasting of it, but gave his approval for it to be printed and publicized. And in the talk over here, sometimes when we're speaking perhaps among friends or something like that, we'll come up with this idea, and it will be something that we'll call perhaps maybe cute, or maybe funny, or maybe nice, or maybe interesting, but we won't give it the sense of holiness that we give to the Rebbe's words. There's things that we say, and then there's, let's call it the truth. There's what the Rebbe says. He doesn't just say cute things. But in this talk, you interestingly enough have a lot of those, which of course mean that it's not a cute saying. It's not a, oh, this is a fascinating connection that may or may not mean something. No, when the Rebbe tells it to us, of course we understand that there's a inherent truth that it lies right here in the words of the Rebbe. So the Rebbe says the fact that this meeting took place in the city of the Rebbe, the city of the leader of the generation, over here is where leaders of other countries, including the leader of this country, had to leave his city, Washington, and come to this city. This shows that it's a direct outcome of the work of the Rebbe in spreading the light of Torah, of Judaism, and more than that, the Rebbe also has been for many years now and is continuing to spread the light of righteousness, not just of Judaism, not just of Torah, but just of how to be a good person in the entire world. And this, the Rebbe says, has been happening from the city. That's why this meeting is taking place here. Now there's a footnote, again, also edited by the Rebbe, that says an amazing idea, even though the simple reason why is the UN in New York? Because being that a lot of countries come together, you don't want anybody to be like, this is my place. If it was in Washington, it would be very obviously America's capital. So you kind of do a place that's nobody's capital. The Rebbe says, that is what people think, but the words of the Rebbe is the amiti. People here know the Hebrew, the word emet. Emes, true. The Rebbe says the true reason is because this is actually the city of the Rebbe. They may not know that that's the reason, but that is. In fact, if you look at something fascinating, the Rebbe points out, and he says, if you look at the foundation of the UN, you'll see how directly it's connected to the Rebbe's arrival to America. And he says the decision to make this place was in 1942. That's the year the Rebbe came to America. His father-in-law came in 1940, but the Rebbe came in 1942. And then it was actually after 1945 that it was established. But the special building, when was that? 1951. What happened in 1951? His father-in-law passed away in 1950. A year later, on his father's first yard site, he took over the leadership. So the Rebbe, again, this is something that would sound like somebody like, I don't know, me or a friend of mine, it could be searching like, oh, this sounds, look how fascinating it is that what the Rebbe spoke about here is connect. The Rebbe is putting this in his edited talk, that we see so clearly that not only events are happening now, but from the conception, from the start of the UN's foundation, it was all direct results of the Rebbe's work. So before I even continue, I think if we go back to our original question, is the UN good or bad? We may have a very, very, very different answer from this talk of the Rebbe. It sounds like it is very good. It sounds like it's not only good, but it's messianic. It sounds like it's the ultimate. It's the purpose of the whole creation of the world. So that's why, of course, the simple answer is the UN good and bad. It's both. It's good in theory. It's good in the idea of the UN. It's good in its mission is to bring peace to the world. There is nothing better than that. Unfortunately, it happens to be an extremely dark, dark place. In fact, the Rebbe once told somebody that was the new ambassador to the UN from Israel that you should know you're going to a place with tremendous amount of darkness, and your job is to be a little candle and try to light up the place. The Rebbe didn't shy away from the fact that the UN was darkness. I think they maybe even called it a house of lies, if I remember the quote correctly. Tremendous darkness there. That is some of the unfortunate reality in how the UN is often working. But it's important for us to distinguish that the idea of the UN is the best idea. The practical way that the UN has been acting is horrible. And those are not a contradiction. There's actually, the Rebbe shows over here, this, I'll bring it up, this is actually very interesting, that there's a famous wall, which is called the Isaiah Wall. which is right across the UN, where it has this quote that we read earlier: "They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." This is what? This is literally the prophecy that Rabbi's speaking about. So we see over here just one place or one proof, so to speak, that the idea that the Rebbe is sharing is not just an idea that, oh, it sounds great that it's connected to Mashiach. No, 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 no. They even formally credit and show this in the famous wall directly by the UN with the quote, and it even got the name of the Isaiah wall. And if we look over here, you could see something interesting where, let's read this together just real quick. This wall that we're referring to was built and dedicated in 1948 during the construction of the UN headquarters, and has the famous quotation from Isaiah that we just read: "They shall beat the swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up swords against nations, neither shall they learn war anymore." Incised into its wall. Known as the Isaiah Wall, it was rededicated in 1975 and had the name Isaiah added under the final word. So nobody should think they just, at random, took a verse or took a sentence from somewhere, but it's actually in the prophecies that speak about the time of Mashiach. So when we think about all of this, we suddenly see that there's a whole different viewpoint and picture of the UN. Now, briefly, I'll mention what the Rebbe continues in this talk, and then I want to get to another important point. The Rebbe also connects the time that it happened. It happened just now. For those of you that are familiar with the Hebrew calendar, we just finished the month of Shvat. Shvat is the 5th month on the Jewish calendar, and that's the month that the previous Rebbe passed away and the Rebbe began his leadership. So he points out, you see how directly it's happening in the month that's like the Rebbe's month, the month where the Rebbe's effect started taking a whole new role. This is when, again, speaking not about himself directly, but in third person about himself, this is when I started to lead Chabad, when I started leading the Jewish people, when I started this whole idea of what we know Chabad as it is today, of spreading the light all over the world, not just being the Chassidus that it was back in the shtetl, just insulated with its community, but out there. That all is this month. So we see it's happening in the city of the Rebbe and at the time of the Rebbe. There's such a direct connection. The Rebbe goes on to make lots of other connections, including to the Torah portion and other things. But the Rebbe points out something fascinating, how we could recognize that this is a part of the process for the coming of Mashiach. The Rebbe says that the idea to not fight and that nations shouldn't be killing each other all day, I don't know about to you, but to me, that's the most common sense in the world. You don't need to be too smart to realize, yeah, let's just live peacefully. That makes the most sense. It's a no-brainer. Yeah, why should we kill each other if we can just live peacefully? Nonetheless, the nature of how the world has existed for thousands of years was one of war. Where today, even till today, if a nation fights with another nation, it is looked at as the craziest thing. We all know what our immediate reaction was when Russia invaded Ukraine just recently. It wasn't like, oh, what do you mean? They're just fighting with their neighbors another day in the park. No. We see that there's clearly a change. Why is this change happening? The Rebbe explains. Obviously, it's because we're right by the coming of Mashiach. If it wasn't because of that, then this logic that exists now existed 1,000 years ago too, and that wasn't the way the world worked then. Suddenly, when we're closer to the time where there'll be peace, there are steps that are happening to show us that direction is already starting to happen in the world. So the fact it's happening now is, of course, another sign that it's a direct outcome for the coming of Mashiach. But the Rebbe finishes off, and this is the point, and I'm sure whoever's listening to the class is burning with some questions like, what? This sounds amazing, except if this is the truth, how did Russia invade Ukraine? How is there a war in Israel now? How is there a war in Ukraine now? How are these happening? So the Rebbe finishes off the talk by answering this question. The signs are pointing so clearly. The UN, It's great. It's nice. It's fine and dandy. Everything is cool. However, how are we still in exile? And the Rebbe explains that this has to demand from us all this question of how are we still in exile and how do we not have yet peace in the whole world? How do we not have the coming of Mashiach in a stronger manner? We've been working for 42 years. The Rebbe took leadership 42 years ago. We have been spreading Judaism, spreading Torah, spreading righteousness to the whole world for so long. We're having impact. And the Rebbe even says more that it's a direct outcome of the fact that the rabbis came together and wrote a halachic ruling. The Rebbe explains that the idea when there's a certain power that God gave the rabbinical court. For example, back in the day of the temple, how do you know when any holiday is on the Jewish calendar? We have a lunar calendar. It depends on when it's a new moon. That's how you know when it's a new month. And that's how you know if the previous month had 29 days or 30 days. And then you'll know if Passover is the 15th day of the month, starting on Sunday or starting on Monday, for example. Who could decide when it's a new moon? Only the court. You need two witnesses to come to the court and decide that. And it's brought down in the Talmud that the angels came to God and said, when is this in this holiday? He said, I don't know. I'm waiting for the court to decide. There's a certain strength that the court has, and that's why there's court. I mean, the rabbinical authority has lots of strength related to, tell somebody that they're married or that they get a get, and so that something is pure or impure, kosher, unkosher. Once it's given by a proper halachic authority, there's a certain strength that comes with it, which impacts the actual physical world. And the Rebbe says just recently there was actually a decision by halachic ruling saying that Mashiach has to come now, and that is perhaps a part of the process why all of this is taking place. And but back to what I was saying. So the Rebbe says, so now that we see so strongly how it's almost there, we have the question even stronger. But how are we not there? And that's why we have this question today, even more than 1992. We're 32 years later. How are we not there? We are seeing negativity between Russia and Ukraine. How are we not there? We see the negativity that happened on Simchat Torah on October 7th. How are we not there? So the question is so strong now, which demands us to demand from God even stronger that he has to bring Mashiach. So is the UN good or bad? The UN is amazing, and it's horrible. It's an amazing idea. It's an amazing foundation, and it has amazing parts to it, but it is terrible in its anti-Israel, and if I can add anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic approach, and all of the negativity that are associated to it. Once we're speaking about this talk, I'm going to finish with this, and then if anybody has any questions, we'll happy for that. The talk that I just mentioned finishes off with perhaps one of the most amazing things that I've ever seen from the Rebbe. So this is very much of a side note to our topic, but it's in that same talk, so I thought it's a good opportunity to share it. I've spoken about this idea many times with a lot of you and many others, that of course we are not only waiting for the coming of Mashiach, for the final redemption, for the Messianic era so strongly, but we even are so excited because we know that the Rebbe, who I believe is the Mashiach, is going to lead the Jewish people. And the idea of the Rebbe being the Mashiach is something that I've recently had conversations with. Actually, a few people one-on-one just came up in different conversations, and we spoke about it from the Talmud and from Maimonides and other places. But a lot of times a question comes up like, what about the Rebbe? Did the Rebbe ever say anything in any direction? And there's different events that occurred over the years. In early 1980s, there was an event where the Hasidim were singing a song relating to the Rebbe being Mashiach, and the Rebbe asked them to not do that. And we know that there's different times for different things. And it's interesting because that happened early 1980s. Suddenly, in late 1980s and early 1990s, there was a very different approach. And in fact, the Rebbe encouraged, for example, singing of a song which specifies that he is Mashiach many, many, many times. But people ask me, did the Rebbe ever say anything more specific about it? And I say like this. The Rebbe never said, I am a Mashiach. the most humble person, doesn't speak that language, even about things not related to him being Mashiach. He always speaks in third person, like I mentioned, and so on and so forth. However, this talk has, in an edited place, again, the Rebbe said many other things, but maybe didn't get the stamp of approval. But here in this talk, in an edited place, is for me the strongest proof. So the Rebbe didn't say, I am Mashiach. But the Rebbe said something similar to, the one in front of you sitting on the red chair who is talking to you right now, he is the Mashiach. What did the Rebbe say? Didn't use those words either, but he said this amazing idea. As he was finishing the talk, so we're praying for the coming of Mashiach now, that's how we always finish off. The words the Rebbe used hundreds of times, what that the coming of Mashiach should be, Tekef umiyad mamish. 3 Hebrew words, which just mean it should be immediately, like as immediate as possible. But the Rebbe said, if you look at those words, you see something interesting. That middle word, miyad, which means immediately, it's 3 Hebrew letters. There's a mem, and then a yud, and then a daled. So the Rebbe says, if you look at it, you could see that each one of the letters stands for a different person's name. The 5th Chabad Rebbe, his name was Dov Ber, that starts with a daled. The 6th Chabad Rebbe, my father-in-law, his name was Yosef Yitzchak. Each of his names started with a yud. And then after the 2 of them, there was Mashiach, whose name is Menachem. And we all know, of course, the Rebbe's name. And who is the Mashiach, whose name is Menachem, that comes right after the Dov Ber, the 5th Chabad Rebbe, and the 6th Chabad Rebbe, the Yosef Yitzchak. Of course, that's the 7th Chabad Rebbe, whose name is Menachem, and who is Mashiach. So that's the place that I like to point to, although there's many places, but where the Rebbe says it so clearly. And it's a very side note, it's the end of the talk, but the Rebbe chose to put it in for publicity, so I thought it's important to share that. But also, I think when we know who the Mashiach is, it's a part of Judaism, meaning to say Maimonides, for example, puts a big emphasis on explaining how we can know who it is. What do we care? Why don't we just wait? Whenever it comes, will be. But know this, before the Messianic era, before the Mashiach comes, before the final redemption, there's an idea of us knowing it. We're not there yet. We don't have the temple yet. We're not at Mashiach. We're not at the final redemption yet. But there's an idea of knowing what is this? So it's explained that if we know prior, there's a certain sense of change that we have within. There's a certain sense of more excitement that we gain from this, and that way we're able to become better people and more prepared for the coming of Mashiach if we do this. So that's, of course, why Maimonides said it's important to know, which is why the Rebbe tells us who it is, and that's why it's important for us to know so we could be better prepared and more excited. So with that, I want to conclude with the prayer that we should have the coming of Mashiach now. I'll say amen to that. And I want to dedicate today's class to my brother. Beryl, you want to come say hi to everybody? To my brother. This is my brother, Beryl. But I want to dedicate today's class to my brother, Yosef Yitzchak. Some people call him Yossi or Yo-Yo, who actually just yesterday got engaged and is now a chassan to a girl from the Holy Land, from Israel. So I am very excited for my brother, for the bride, for the groom. And I am excited, hopefully, to be going to the Holy Land very soon for the wedding. It is super, super exciting, and can't wait for everybody to get to meet the bride and groom themselves. I'm sure they can make it to Springfield sometime soon. But with that, I'm going to conclude the recording, and if anybody has any questions, I will be here. Thank you all so much for tuning in and for joining.